guess we're about time. I welcome everyone to the 5th round of the Whipper Debating Championships. My name is Byron Newson. Your adjudicators today are also Sam Nelson and James Haft. The motion today is that this House believes that Robert Mugabe should be prosecuted for crimes against humanity, and I call upon the Prime Minister to open the government's case.
Ladies and gentlemen, this team unashamedly believes in the universality of human rights and the universality of principles that oppose crimes against humanity, whether they're committed by the leader of a nation or by anyone else. We think that a man like Robert Mugabe, who murdered tens of thousands of the Ndebele tribe in the late 1980s, who's led to the forced relocation of thousands of people, and who's allowed for mass starvation in a way that amounts to genocide under many provisions, is not someone who should be allowed to continue having that without a powerful international symbol that those crimes are recognised and that those crimes are wrong. So what do we need to do? First off, we think the International Criminal Court should prepare a case over a period that allows them to, make that case. We don't think that'll be hard. We all know about his crimes, and indict Robert Mugabe. We think if at all possible, they should extradite that man, but given that he is the leader of that nation presently, then it's most likely that trial will have to take place in absentia, as is currently happening for members of the Janjaweed, where cases are being prepared by the special prosecutors of the ICC. And we think finally the likely result of that is a conviction for Robert Mugabe. We think probably also that it would be a good idea if, like the Slobodan Milosevic trial, this trial were televised so that the world can watch this man fall from grace. So why do we want to do that? In the first place, because we believe that justice is the most important principle here. Secondly, because we think it'll bolster support for the opposition in Zimbabwe and further degrade his credibility. And finally, because we think it'll stop providing political cover for countries like South Africa that are acting entirely irresponsibly in this situation. Firstly, on the moral imperative. We believe that throughout his decades-long regime, Robert Mugabe has been a repressive and despotic leader. But more specifically, and more importantly in this case, there have been particular incidents in which he has certainly committed crimes against humanity, most pressingly the genocide of the Ndebele tribe in the late 1980s, which involved the mass murder of between 10 and 20,000 people. We think concerningly recently that he's allowed the refusal of foreign aid, which would have fed people who are dying because of the food crisis. There's now 8 to 9 million people who need food, and that's recognised from incidents like the Ukrainian famine. That is a category of genocide. The cholera epidemic is another situation in which he's refused aid that would have saved people's lives. Yes, Amir.
In June 2008, we brought ICC charges against al-Bashir in Sudan. How's that worked out?
Well, it's June 2008. These things take time. Cases, take a long time to prepare, and we think the ICC should take as long as they need to do that. But we just don't believe that there'll be a particular problem with getting a conviction for Robert Mugabe, because there's thousands of exiles from Zimbabwe. They're prepared to testify to what he's done. What's more, because the security forces in Zimbabwe, because their wages are being destroyed by the hyperinflation there, are now moving away from him, and they're going to be able to provide evidence if we offer things like constructive amnesties that the ICC has offered to people in other situations. So the idea that this despotic ruler, who's made no bones about the kind of crimes he's committed, is going to get off on these charges is absolutely absurd. So, why is it so important that we get a conviction for this man? In the first place, as a clear demonstration that leaders aren't immune from the principles of international law. There is, at the moment today, a battle going on in terms of the way that international law is seen between most of the world's nations that believe in principles of universality, of things like the ICC, and a particular category of countries, and particularly nations like China, nations like the Sudan, and nations like South Africa that believe in an extended principle of sovereignty, which allows leaders to get away with doing whatever they want because they don't believe in international intervention. We need clear symbols of the way that battle happens, because otherwise it means that we don't get allowances for interventions on a more basic level in those countries if we say that the principles of international law are against that sovereignty. But secondly, and more importantly, we think it's absolutely crucial that the people who feel ignored, who feel disrespected, and live in constant trauma because of the crimes that have been committed against them and their families get closure and get justice for that. These are the forgotten people in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, but by the 4-minute mark in the Prime Minister's speech, they are forgotten no more, because we acknowledge that they're the people who are the real victims of this. the victim, funnily enough, of his crimes. And they're the people that this debate is fundamentally about and why it's so important that they get justice. Yes, sir.
So what about the people you're forgetting when Robert Mugabe clings to power and remains in the power to make sure he doesn't get prosecuted?
Well, it's interesting enough that you should say that. A, he will try to cling to power because it's quite likely that a new Zimbabwean government would, for instance, string him up by a lamppost. For one thing. It's not as though he's going to get off lightly when the other people get into power, especially when the forces within Robert Mugabe's security forces are turning against him. They're not nice guys. They're the people that were actually out there killing all those people. So there's good reasons for him to cling to power regardless of whether the ICC is there or not. Just under our model, when he doesn't cling to power anymore, he can be immediately turned over. In Zimbabwe, as Julia's going to talk about, doesn't have to have an internecine conflict in the aftermath of his regime. So secondly, this bolsters support for opposition and loses credibility for Robert Mugabe. Robert Mugabe has for years gotten by on the lie that international opposition to him is in fact a British plot against him. He has characterised all of the opposition as the work of Tony Blair, as the work of evil imperialists. The difference with this type of opposition to him is that it is clearly non-political and judicial, and that it is global in its scope. It is an international institution and not just the British. And the things that have hurt his credibility the most are when international organisations like the Commonwealth, which is mostly made up of African countries, have said that they clearly oppose him. It's when his team has stopped being able to play cricket against countries that are clearly not aligned with the United Kingdom. So we need this opposition to him to become broader than it has been to further destroy that credibility. We think that will embolden the opposition within Zimbabwe, and especially embolden people who've been living in fear and don't particularly believe that it is possible for them to oppose him. When we send this clear signal of pariah status and embolden those people, it makes it easier. But finally, ladies and gentlemen, we think that one of the most important ways in which Robert Mugabe has been able to cling to power is because of the support of his big, powerful and comparably wealthy neighbour, South Africa. And it's because the leaders of South Africa have been propagating lies about him being an anti-apartheid hero who continues to do the best thing by his people, and because the largely pro-ANC media has swallowed those lies and told them to South African people. But now we're getting a new leadership in South Africa under Zuma. We're getting rid of Mbeki, and we're creating a situation where when we get an ICC conviction from Mugabe, that the democratic will of the South African people will be shown that this man isn't the hero that they've been lied to about, that there are good reasons to oppose him, and that South Africa's appeasement policy of Zimbabwe can't work anymore. When the South African people see his crimes, when they see the cholera epidemic, when they see the indictments against him and the conviction, we think they're going to turn against him and turn their government against him. Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of justice, in the interest of the Zimbabwe opposition, and the interest of cleaving the link between South Africa and Zimbabwe, we need to convict this man.
Yeah.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech and call upon the opposition leader to open the opposition's case.
You have to really... Yeah.
2 extra points.
A minute. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to deal with 3 rebuttals in my argumentation. Firstly, I'm going to deal with the policy and the justification that came out from side over the government. This idea of human rights abuses and starvation and internal turmoil within Zimbabwe. Secondly, I'm going to do this argument on how there's a need for closure, how we need to embolden the opposition to actually do something correct. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about very briefly on this effects upon the international community, like on South Africa, like what they talk about. Let's do the first thing first, the policy and the justification. And what they heard coming from them was a somewhat pseudo, I don't know what I'm doing kind of policy. Because they say what, we just want to have a charge level get him. They didn't say whether they're going to actually actively try to put him out of power, whether they're trying to intervene, or whether they're trying to actually actualize the charge that's been leveled against him. We think that's the example that's brought up by closing, that's why when the charge was leveled against Sudan, nothing didn't happen at all. So we think that, ladies and gentlemen, their policy was basically ineffectual. But never mind that. The second justification that came up from side opening was this, that there was a lot of genocide happening, like what happened in, I don't know what, 1990s? And it sounded like something that's pretty small. We've got a couple of responses to that. Hold on, listen, I know it sounds pretty important.
Sir, come on.
We look at the definition of crimes against humanity. We look at what happened in Rwanda, 800,000 people were killed. We look at what happened in Kosovo, 300,000 people were killed. And that's what legitimized intervention or a charge of a crime against humanity. We look at the contrast, ladies and gentlemen. In China, when the Tianjin massacre occurred, nearly 3,000 people were killed, but the international community did jump on that and say that was a crime against humanity because there needs to be a need to balance this charge versus the need to balance international committee and engagement, ladies and gentlemen, which is something Mark will further go on to elaborate on. So we think their definition of crimes against humanity screws up the existing ones and makes it easier to undermine international law and further legitimizes other kinds of interventions based on wrong numbers, based on that kind of scale. They aren't necessarily talking. No thank you, sir. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we think this is where the debate really begins. This debate ain't about whether Mugabe has done something wrong, because side opposition ain't going to argue he's guiltless. We say this is not a debate. The debate, therefore, is, given we know he has already done something wrong, what do you do about it to ensure that the population within his country is better protected? Whether it's a policy of engagement or whether the policy of active isolation coming out from open government. That's the debate, ladies and gentlemen. We think we shouldn't let bygones be bygones, but we should be practical about chances of getting things actually benefiting. Second rebuttal, ladies and gentlemen, how they said, you know what, it's going to embolden the opposition, and therefore that's good because there's some kind of upward mobility. We got a couple of responses to that as well. Firstly, we look at the opposition within Zimbabwe. We say the movement for democratic change has already been trying throughout the entire 10 or 20 decades. We don't see how it's going to increase emboldenment of the opposition. But more importantly, we say this is a better point. We say what it creates is a pariah state. It creates a siege mentality where the leader within Zimbabwe can say, look, we are being oppressed by the West again. We are being besieged by Western imperialism, and they're going to close our borders. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it creates the pariah state where they say, now we should unite as Africa against the West. And that is what we saw happening in North Korea, ladies and gentlemen, when you tried to embargo them, and North Korea, Kim Jong-il said, look, that's evidence that I'm actually doing something right, and the West is trying to repeatedly oppress me. No, thank you, all of you. We say that's going to repeat itself in this situation. But more importantly is the last point of rebuttal. This idea of how South Africa is going to rally around the West because this gives them legitimacy. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that's not true. If you look at the past precedents of South Africa's engagement with the West, they've detested Western influence to begin with. That's why they had their own South African Development Committee to deal with problems within South Africa and Zimbabwe and even Congo. We say you give them fuel to the fire and embolden militias and radical groups within South Africa to once again latch onto this and say now we have a reason to go against the West. That's the division they cause. They drive a wedge within the international community. Opening.
So Mugabe's already got a siege mentality. Isn't the difference with this that this is judicial, not political, and independent, not Western?
Hold on. No, we don't think so. We think obviously we're going to concede that Mugabe currently has control. That's not something we deny. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, this isn't a debate about absolutes. He's going to further try to stay in power. He's going to exhaust all other means to ensure all political opposition is eradicated. And this is where it nicely brings me on to my substantive. Because I'm going to give them some facts about what Zimbabwe is in the current context. So I'm going to talk about, ladies and gentlemen, what's best for the people of Zimbabwe and the state itself. And I've got a couple of things I want to talk about. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the situation within Zimbabwe itself. We look at the current status quo where they are actually talking to the movement of democratic change. Just this year, Mugabe made a constitutional amendment providing for the Prime Minister's slot to be offered to Morgan Tsvangirai. We say just recently this year as well, they allowed for 15 South African development communities to actually actively engage in dialogue with Robert Mugabe. We say now Thabo Mbeki, even though he's an ex-South African president, is an integral part of engagement and dialogue. They're starting to accept Western aid, foreign aid to deal with cholera and, for example, malnutrition within the country. That's the progress US, South Africa, and Zimbabwe has actually made, and that status quo. So what is the effect their policy does if they want to actively prosecute Robert Mugabe? We say, ladies and gentlemen, a couple of things. Firstly, it leads to a regressive step backwards because now Mugabe would have incentive to cling on to power even more. We say here, ladies and gentlemen, yes, he already has power, but now he has an incentive to revoke all the kind of concessions he's given to the opposition as of the status quo we've provided. Why is that the case, ladies and gentlemen? Why does he have incentive to cling on to power? Because when he is in power, he can organize his state-controlled militia to protect him under the banner of sovereignty, under the banner of the democratic process, and that's the danger, ladies and gentlemen. You make him more reluctant to relinquish political control over the democratic process. What does that again lead to? The second consequence is, ladies and gentlemen, you make him revoke on the changes he's already made. You make him go back to the days of 2006, when Morgan Tsvangirai was exiled from Zimbabwe, when now at least he's in the country trying to contest elections. You make him have his private militia, like in December 2006, openly gun down political dissidents. And that was what happened then, before any kind of engagement actually happened. Now you're going to revoke on all that kind of progress. Third effect, ladies and gentlemen, we say he's going to turn to China for moral support. And China ain't exactly the best bastion of moral values and human rights. Like in 2007, when the EU placed an embargo on China, and on Zimbabwe, and what did Zimbabwe do? They just turned to China to buy arms. You're going to drive them into the arms of other countries which have dubious track records and further isolate them from the rest of the world. You remove any possibility of engagement and dialogue and constructive discussion. We think that's a bad thing. At the end of the debate, ladies and gentlemen, side opposition concedes entirely to the case of proposition that he's not exactly the best person we have around. But we say that's not the debate, ladies and gentlemen. This debate is what best do we do with that situation at hand? How do we better protect the people within Zimbabwe we are proud to oppose?
I thank the opposition leader for his speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government's case.
Here are some facts. That the agreement between Robert Mugabe and the Movement for Democratic Change has, if indeed it ever properly existed, entirely fallen apart. Here are facts. Robert Mugabe has shut Nelson Mandela and Jimmy Carter out of that country. Here are facts. Robert Mugabe's government has stolen food aid, even as between 8 and 9 million people starve in that country. Robert Mugabe, as thousands of his people perish from a disease eradicated in the West, has suggested that a cholera epidemic is over. And here is another fact, that justice in that circumstance matters, and that in and of itself is important. So, to the first question, has indeed Mr. Mugabe committed crimes worthy of prosecution? Well, we say our first question is how many millions of people must die before a genocide is declared? And funnily enough, you don't have to take our word for it, but the international community has an answer on this, and they said that in the massacre that occurred in Srebrenica during the Balkans Wars, when we're talking about a matter of hundreds of deaths, that in and of itself could be said to be genocide. But moreover, when we talk about conflicts like Rwanda, conflicts like Sudan, this is the scale of conflict, this is the scale of destruction being perpetrated in Zimbabwe. And moreover, we think the prosecution will be easier in this case because, as the opposition leader himself told me, this is a one-man state. And we think, unlike the fragmented conflict that you experience in the Sudan, all roads lead to Harare, ladies and gentlemen, and all roads lead to Robert Mugabe. So we, in this debate, won't allow NUSB to adjudicate the guilt of Robert Mugabe, ladies and gentlemen. We say we would turn him over to the international community because, like you, we don't think he's the best guy around. But moreover, we say, what are the alternatives? And I'm going to talk in a moment about the problem of breaking a post-Mugabe government down into internecine conflict. But moreover, we say at the moment people are afraid to support the opposition in that country, but a complete rejection by the international community of the legitimacy of that government is indeed important. And as Tim accurately pointed out in a point of information, that is a judicial rather than political rejection of the, I beg your pardon, of the legitimacy of that government. But moreover, it is independent rather than Western. Thirdly and finally, it absolutely contradicts the rhetoric that the South African government is feeding the South African people about the activities of Robert Mugabe. We say that trial gets on South African television and the tide of public opinion in that country, the tide in the SADC countries turns away from Mugabe. So we say things are getting worse, not better in that country, but moreover, that since 2006, the trend has been towards pushing Mugabe's government into pariah status. That's why he's been expelled from the Commonwealth, turned away from the Beijing Olympics. And we say, this is a man who will never deal. We shouldn't attempt to do so. So in my substantive, I want to talk about two things. But before I do that, I'll take the gentleman.
Yeah, Emerson Mnangagwa and the other members of the Joint Operations Command who were behind the Matabeleland massacres and are currently in positions of power behind Mugabe still remain untried under your system.
They should be tried too.
Here.
So ladies and gentlemen, in my speech today, they should be tried too. They're not in the topic, but we're not opposed. In my speech, in my substantive material today, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk first about the reconstruction of Zimbabwe, because although we didn't hear it explicitly from the opening opposition, there was a tacit concession that indeed the Mugabe regime is on the way out, not least because that man is, older than John McCain, ladies and gentlemen, so we think that that's likely to be the case. So when we talk about the reconstruction of Zimbabwe, or indeed any policy that considers how the international community must interact with Zimbabwe, that must be with a long-range view. We say that refusing to try Robert Mugabe outside of that country in an independent forum leads to an internecine conflict within that country in a reconstructed Zimbabwe. We say that victor's justice is the very worst thing that could happen in a reconstructed Zimbabwe, is the very worst thing that could happen for the opposition movement in that country and for the credibility of the MDC in that country. Well, how do we know that, ladies and gentlemen? Well, when we look to, say, the experience of Iraq in its attempt to reconstruct, in its attempt to use the trial of Saddam Hussein as a beachhead for that reconstruction, we say that the polarisation that occurred around that trial, because it was held in country, the perception of that trial was that it represented victors' justice, an attempt by those victors to consolidate their power within the confines of that country, led to a breakdown of a fragile peace within Iraq. And we say those accusations of victors' justice in and of themselves are likely to be problematic. So we say, in the alternative, what does the advantage of trialling Robert Mugabe, either in absentia or in person, offer you? We say the first thing that it offers is closure. We say it offers closure for landowners who've had their property confiscated. We say it offers closure for husbands who have to watch their wives being raped and then killed, ladies and gentlemen. We say it offers closure for parents who've watched their children starve while soldiers rob them of food. And we think that all of that is important, but moreover, it means that there can exist for those people some confidence in that process, but moreover, in a rejection of the government of that past. The alternative to that process is victors' justice within that country, or an ignorance of those past wrongs. I'll take the gentleman.
Ma'am, I'm slightly confused here. What type of victor's justice are we talking about? Are you saying that the MDC is suddenly going to sweep into power and hang him?
We're saying that whatever the alternative operated, and indeed that was the case in Iraq, we say that whatever alternative is taken, that perception that there exists some internecine attempt to consolidate political power undermines the fragility of a new government within that country and its credibility. Moreover, I want to talk about the interrelationship between international law, with particular reference to the African region. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, that sovereignty is a contract between a nation state and the international community. And that sovereignty of given governments should be adjudicable, especially in circumstances where there is no alternative. And we say the existing measures to condemn the sovereignty of Robert Mugabe's government have failed outright, and that this measure is an important judicial reflection on Mugabe's government. But moreover, It says that the international community has an interest in this region. It says that the alternatives within that region have failed and that there can be some broader international interest beyond the pressure on Africans to solve African problems. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a humanitarian problem we propose.
I only have this. Do you have an extra pen? Sure. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for a speech and call upon the Deputy Opposition Leader to continue the Opposition's case.
Mr. Speaker, I suppose the big question I have for side proposition is what do you hope to achieve out of this? Given that you're not getting Mugabe out of power, you're maybe, but definitely actually not improving the status of the opposition. Given that they've said that they're going to bring justice, but is that justice really the absolute goal for this debate? And what we tell you instead, Mr. Speaker, is what we should be trying to do as an international community is try to protect the Zimbabwean people. Protect the people whose lives are on the line. Protect the people who have to live in the state. And to a certain extent, Mr. Speaker, that may mean we ignore the principles of justice. We ignore the principles of remuneration. Why? Because we think that it's fundamentally right for us, and this is my first point of rebuttal, we think that it's fundamentally right for us to consider those whose rights are in immediate danger, whose rights to life, liberty, to food, shelter, accommodation, all of these things are in risk for the Zimbabwean people here and now. So what we say fundamentally is that this is what we must be after. This is what we must protect. That's the first thing, Mr. Speaker. But more to the point, we say, how do we best achieve this? And we look at this in terms of the whole engagement versus isolationism. And what we say is that what this side intends to do is essentially push Zimbabwe away from the West. Push Zimbabwe away from the moderating influence of the West that has seen things like Mugabe accepting food aid, seen things like Mugabe accepting humanitarian aid for the cholera outbreak. And yes, we agree, there are still problems. He's not the nicest guy. But what we see is that there is a path, and he is moving down towards greater, towards giving the Zimbabwean people greater freedom. So what we say is that we see this movement working, and we see it as being part of a continued process of engagement on the part of the West, and particularly on the part of the South African development community. What does their policy do? Well, firstly, we say that by isolating him, he's only going to turn away from the West, he's going to turn away from these moderating influences and turn to China, to Russia, to other places where he can get guns, where he can get money to prop up his failing economy, where he can still steal food aid. So we don't see him, their policy actually doing anything to weaken the situation in there. More to the point, we think that it's worse because it undermines the ability of the West to actually engage with him, undermines the ability of the West to actually, talk to him and engage and, have meetings between like Jimmy Carter or Nelson Mandela and get them even going into the country in the first place. So what we say is that this is what the harm that we're talking about. You no longer get the type of engagement, he just ramps up his anti-Western rhetoric once again. What happens when this happens? What happens when this happens? It actually means when he's clinging to power and when he feels less secure because the West is going against him, he actually becomes more brutal with dealing with the opposition as opposed to less brutal as they seem to want to portray it on this side. He actually becomes more violent and more rights are put under pressure. It's only when he feels that he can safeguard his own personal safety and security that we've seen the type of concessions that we're actually seeing under the status quo. So what we say, remain standing, Lord. So what we see happening, Mr. Speaker, is they're actually pushing him further. The last point on this is that you undermine the South African development community because you essentially say you aren't good enough to do with this. We have lost faith in you, and that's the greatest tool of leverage that we have over Mugabe in the status quo.
Sir, Robert Mugabe has made a career out of saying that the West hates him. I don't understand why any policy could make him hate the West even more.
I'd just like to take this opportunity to congratulate Ateneo on their wonderful dress sense for this tournament, and do a quick plug for GeoPower as well. What we say, Mr. Speaker, is yes, he has made a career out of doing this, and now you're providing the tangible evidence for him to actually go and say, hey, look, the West is against us. The West wants to intervene. The West wants to, get me out of power. I need protection. I need protection because this could happen to your next leader. This could happen to anyone in Africa. So what we say, Mr. Speaker, is this actually makes the situation worse. No, thank you. But the last quick idea that I want to deal with was the extension coming from the Deputy Prime Minister. Because what she told us is, you know what, it's going to be Victor's justice and he's going to be tried and hung. We don't see that as what's going to happen in Zimbabwe. What we see is the status quo, slow progression. He gives up power. You see power sharing agreements becoming more and more common. The opposition slowly taking over more and more until he finally steps down. Perhaps with amnesty, perhaps not. That's not part of the debate. But we don't see this type of Victor's justice idea being particularly relevant. What do I want to talk to you about, Mr. Speaker? I want to talk to you about the international effects of this policy. Because what we say is it's fundamentally bad for everyone to use the ICC in this manner. Why? The ICC was made or designed to deal with the worst crimes against humanity. The type of 800,000 people dead crimes. The type of Rwandas and all of those, Mr. Speaker. We said that when you choose to deal with this and essentially, lower the bar for the type of charges that can be brought to the ICC, you lose international support for that very organisation. Let me remind you that quite a few countries in the world don't see Zimbabwe as being all that bad. Russia and China are taking active steps to defend him. So if this type of prosecution goes ahead, it won't be seen as independent, it won't be seen as international, it will be seen as a political decision on the part of the West to charge a leader they don't like. So we don't see where opening government is getting that idea from. No, thank you, sit down. More to the point though, Mr. Speaker, we say that with this type of decision, with this type of action on the part of the ICC, you actually weaken the type of international agreement that the ICC represents. Why is this? The ICC came together essentially to stop the worst of the worst crimes, Mr. Speaker, to stop the huge genocides that we saw in Rwanda, that we saw happening in Rwanda and Kosovo. No, thank you. What we say is that when you lose this type of international support, when you allow the ICC to essentially become a tool for the West to do things that it wants to intervene because of humanitarian reasons, something that there is no international consensus upon, for the West to actually intervene because, we don't like some guy, for the West to intervene because we think that there is not enough, and we think that you as African leaders are not doing enough. We said that's when you politicise the ICC, and that's when you drive other countries out of it. They no longer want to be part of this. They don't see the same ideals and representation that the West has. More to the point, when you drive these countries out of it, they are no longer bound by it. The ICC's jurisdiction only occurs in countries that agree to be bound by the jurisdiction. This means it's even harder to get war criminals out of certain countries. It means it's even harder to bring them to trial in the first place. So what we say is that you fundamentally weaken our defence against the most heinous crimes by using the ICC in this circumstance. We say further damages the credibility, but more to the point, because of the fact that Zimbabwe never signed on to the ICC Charter, and that the Zimbabwe isn't even in this ICC's jurisdiction, you're talking about a huge expansion and scope of ICC powers. This makes even countries like America nervous, because they now don't know who can be charged for war crimes, because you've lowered the bar, and they don't know where or what type of protection they can get for war crimes, because you're now extending the jurisdiction arbitrarily. What have we shown you, Mr. Speaker? We've shown you that, okay, we agree, Zimbabwe's in a bad shape, Mugabe's not a great guy, but how do you protect the people on the ground? It's by engaging, maintaining nominal control. That's what Weetsian brought you. I've told you this is how you protect the world from the most heinous crimes and keep the ICC running. For those reasons, we oppose.
I thank the Deputy Opposition Leader for his speech and call upon the government member to continue the government side.
In this debate, the well-dressed team Geopower is going to address something very important in international politics, and that is the nature of international politics as multilateral. And we're going to look at it from the perspective of institutions and bureaucracies, because our fundamental principle is that given the world order, it is institutions and bureaucracies that enable change. So the question we seek to answer is, how do you empower multilateral bureaucracies and institutions to alleviate suffering in particular contexts like Zimbabwe? We say this is necessary because this is the way the New World Order has been structured. It has been structured multilaterally, and as we've seen in Iraq, anything that's not multilateral, anything that does not have legitimacy is likely to collapse. And we're going to argue that this particular process of legitimizing it within the ICC gives it the international rhetoric and legitimacy that will enable change in these particular contexts. But before I proceed to that, let me rebut 2 ideas, or 3 ideas, sorry, rather coming from the previous speaker. The first is this entire argument about how our model pushes Mugabe away from the West. What is the assumption here? The assumption is that Mugabe is a prodigal son, that you can moderate him, that he's going to come back to the Western fold because I love the West so much. Never mind. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. That he's made a living out of condemning the West, out of saying that Tony Blair is going to hate him no matter what, the United States is going to hate him no matter what. But they say this provides him with the evidence. We say that for Mugabe, that evidence has always been there, and he's going to use that evidence regardless. Now, this is their argument as to why Mugabe is moderate. Their argument is Mugabe is moderate because he accepts food aid. That is ridiculous, Mr. Chair. No, thank you. Because just because he's accepting aid, that doesn't necessarily mean he loves the West. That means he has on-the-ground needs that he needs to respond to if he wants to maintain power, which is exactly what he wants to do. So you are mistaking somebody being Machiavellian for somebody being Western-loving, which is ridiculous. The second argument I want to talk about is an entire argument about how this process politicizes the ICC. Because China, no thanks, and Russia would continue to complain. But what I think is this: in the international community, people will always complain. There will always be bitches. And so no matter what you do, they are going to complain. So the question we need to answer is, where is it easier for countries like China and Russia to complain? In the status quo, where you have the United States solely condemning Zimbabwe, or under our model, where in the condemnation of the United States gets backed up by a legitimate ruling from a legitimate institution. We see that reduces the odds of them complaining. The third argument he talked about was this: well, Zimbabwe didn't sign up for ICC, therefore we cannot try Mugabe. But what we say this is doing is that he is in effect hiding behind sovereignty to deny international justice. In the current world order, there are things more important than static interpretations of state sovereignty. And we say that international justice, as we've demonstrated, is more paramount at the end of the day. So let me talk about 2 things today. First, I'm going to be talking about the how our model is corrective of dangerously conservative tendencies in the United Nations. And secondly, I'm going to be talking about how our policy actually strengthens the ICC, working from the institutional framework that I outlined earlier on. But yes, Amit.
Sir, why are you comfortable cutting the African Union and every neighbouring African nation out of a solution to Zimbabwe?
Oh, in fact, I'm going to argue that this empowers the African Union in my analysis. So let me look at my first argument. It's corrective of dangerously conservative tendencies in the United Nations. Now let's look at the record of the United Nations. If you look at a previous similar case, the case of Rwanda, they were very conservative in that case in the sense that they intervened in the last minute. And a lot of people had to die before the United Nations did anything. Why? Because they were trying to protect the credibility of the United Nations. They were like, oh, we don't want to come in yet because if we make a mistake and people perceive it as illegitimate, then the United Nations will be illegitimate as well. We say this is also what is happening in the context of Zimbabwe. And we see that has been dangerous before. So what do we need to do? We need to counter this bureaucratic conservatism in the context of the United Nations that leads to inaction. So how do we do this through an ICC conviction? We see what an ICC conviction does is that it makes advocates within the United Nations more credible because they will be able to use this rhetoric of this is an indicted war criminal. So they will be strengthened as well. Why? Because now, why does it solve the problem? Now the United Nations will be able to have that legal legitimacy to intervene, to sanction, and in extreme cases, militarily intervene. And we see that's particularly important given the fact that the United Nations is very conservative. Moreover, this is a UN-affiliated body that will solve this particular problem. It's a formal process. And if you look at particular bureaucracies, if you look at the structure of bureaucracies, they operate when they think that something is formal and legitimate. And we think that the court proceeding, which is formal, which goes through a big process, is precisely the kind of rhetoric the United Nations needs in order to move. I'm going to be talking about how this translates to the context of Africa and how this translates to the concept of China when I take a minute.
You're aware that if you want international condemnation, that you've already got it and you've had it for a certain amount of time that it hasn't worked, right?
Not really, because we need to consolidate that. And by the way, if you run that case, you're going to lose because you're contradicting them because they're saying that international condemnation has not yet solidified. So let me look at how this not only translates to the UN, but also translates into the context of the African Union. We say that in the African Union, a lot of members of the African Union are going, we can't be active because the United Nations hasn't done anything yet. This is part of the rhetoric of South Africa. They said, said, well, we're just an we're a smaller institution and we need to work with the legitimacy of the United Nations. So we say if you solve the problem of the UN and if you create movement there, then you create movement within Africa as well. And moreover, we say even in China and Russia, their excuse right now is that Mugabe is a sovereign leader, ladies and gentlemen. We say that under a model wherein you condemn Robert Mugabe, it becomes harder to run that rhetoric when the ICC, an institution that is legitimate, has ruled that this guy is a killer, Mr. Chair. So we say even the inactivity within the context of China and Russia can be solved by a legitimate bureaucratic process that everybody respects. Now, even if the United States has not signed on to the ICC, they recognize it as an official international court. China and Russia also recognize it as an official international court, and they don't condemn actions that the ICC does. They just don't want to sign up for it because they're hypocritical. But anyway, moving on to the second argument, and we want to talk about how this debate should transcend the case of Zimbabwe. We want to talk about how it strengthens the ICC, because if you look at the particular context of world politics, the ICC is under siege. It is always being criticized for being unresponsive. It is also always being criticized for not responding to its mandate of bringing people to justice. We say that a high-profile conviction, as in the case of Mugabe, and especially if you also convict al-Bashir, we say there are trends to prove that that's happening. We say that legitimizes and strengthens the ICC further, so that the implications of that transcend Zimbabwe. When you have an ICC that has teeth, when you have an ICC that works, that sends a message to war criminals and people who commit genocide that the international community will not accept this kind of behavior. So what we say is that we should make an example out of Robert Mugabe. We should try him in absentia to send a message to other violent African leaders in Somalia and other violent leaders perhaps in the Philippines, like Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, but that's another issue. Because of that, ladies and gentlemen, we say that what our model does is that it establishes the bureaucratic legitimacy needed to bring people to justice. And in the context of an international world order that is reliant on bureaucracies, this is what we need. Thanks.
I thank the member for the government for his speech and call upon the member for the opposition. Making sure everyone was in the right order. I forgot to check in the beginning, sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, the government in this debate has presented a principled but reactionary case that doesn't solve the problems and does not discharge the moral responsibility that they have laid upon everyone in this debate. The moral obligation that we have is to find a solution for Zimbabwe in the short term and in the long term. And what I'm going to be showing you in our extension is exactly how the only solution to change in Zimbabwe requires there to be no outstanding ICC conviction. How this destroys any chance of Robert Mugabe stepping aside, and I'll give you the mechanism by which he will otherwise. The second part of the extension that we'll show you, ladies and gentlemen, is how a united Africa, the South African Development Congress and the African Union need to be involved in any solution to Zimbabwe, both to get a real solution in Zimbabwe now, but also to ensure that we have long-term stability in Zimbabwe, and to ensure that Africa as a region, which has many other problems besides Zimbabwe itself, has a strong and powerful body capable of doing that. This is the extension we'll present to you. But before I do that, I just want to have a look at two areas of rebuttal. Firstly, I want to have a look at the extension couched around multilateralism and international organizations. Secondly, I want to have a look at more from the opening in terms of progress and how this is good or bad and how evil Mugabe is, which we all agree on. Let's talk about multilateralism, because what we heard from the lawyer is that there is no international condemnation of Robert Mugabe at the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't knifing our opening. This is explaining that the international community thinks Robert Mugabe is evil, but doesn't think that he should be tried in the International Criminal Court. That's what the South African Development Congress and the African Union want. They want Robert Mugabe to no longer be in sole power. I'll explain more about the power sharing they want. But they recognize it's bad that international condemnation exists. The idea that America is the only people is just ludicrous. Then they told us this is going to strengthen all the international institutions involved. Firstly, let's talk about the International Criminal Court. The point I made about Bashir in Sudan, the point we're making here, ladies and gentlemen, is that when the International Criminal Court doesn't secure convictions, it doesn't make it look stronger because it brought a case and a principled stance. It makes it look weak. It makes international law look ludicrous. And when people don't respect international law because it doesn't deliver outcomes, they don't follow it. Because there is no jurisdiction, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't exist. And they told us this might make it easier for the United Nations to intervene. Ladies and gentlemen, the Russia-China defense of sovereignty that they gave us still stands. Sovereignty says no matter how bad they are within their country, we don't support it. Because if this was truly apolitical and we were just looking at the scale of bad things, we'd be throwing charges against the leadership in China, ladies and gentlemen. We'd be throwing charges against George W. Bush for fighting a war with no just cause, ladies and gentlemen. If they were truly apolitical, it would be that way. But it's not. Then let's talk about building a case for and engaging Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, what you'll hear much more in my extension is that this completely undermines the efforts and the actions that African bodies in the region have already taken to make progress. The second area, now that I've dealt with multilateralism, is to talk about progress in this area. We heard that Robert Mugabe's rhetoric won't change. Well, no, it won't. It never will change, ladies and gentlemen. But the rhetoric we're interested in is his ability to work with other African states to find a solution. It doesn't have to change that. Then we heard this will empower opposition because it'll be seen as apolitical. Ladies and gentlemen, what bullshit. I just told you why this is not going to be seen as apolitical, because the International Criminal Court makes political decisions about who to try all the time. Ladies and gentlemen. So we don't think this empowers the opposition in any way, shape or form. And then we're accused of, well, maybe we're standing back too late and it'll just be another Rwanda. Well, firstly, guys, your opening team told us that this would take as long as it takes to secure a conviction. And that could number in the tens of years as it's taken in other cases like Slobodan Milosevic. The second part of this, ladies and gentlemen, is we think that this is simply putting off and setting back a solution. So of course it's going to be too late. Sorry, Julia.
The MDC won an election and forged a power-sharing government, which then collapsed. Neither convinced Robert Mugabe to give up power. Why are you so naive as to believe there'll be a peaceful transition?
Julia, this is my extension. Let's talk about Zimbabwe and what's going to happen here. Two parts. The first part, Zimbabwean politics and a solution to the crisis in Zimbabwe. The second part I'll give you is on multilateralism and regionalism. The problem, Julia, is that we don't have many good options in Zimbabwe. It's a farce if you think that their solution will do anything to fix it, right? What I'm going to show you is we will do something to fix it, they make it worse. So, what's the problem, right? The reason that power sharing agreements are happening at all is because the African Union and the South African Development Congress are putting enormous pressure on Robert Mugabe to see through these power sharing agreements. Newsflash, if he could get away with not having this power sharing, he wouldn't have been doing it. But he was forced into it by his allies and his regional neighbours. In fact, South Africa, under Jacob Zuma, is putting more pressure on him than they did under Thabo Mbeki. That's a change in the last 2 months. Get up to date with the facts. The situation, ladies and gentlemen, and the reason that it is so imperative for Robert Mugabe to ensure power sharing, and what their problem does, is that he needs to find a way out. Because if he doesn't find a way to keep some sort of power to protect himself, then of course he will fear for his life. And what their system does, ladies and gentlemen, is say that under anything except total control, we will take you out of that country. The reason they couldn't get him was he was a sovereign leader, right? As soon as he is no longer the sole sovereign leader, of course the fear is that he will be taken away to the International Criminal Court in The Hague and tried with almost certain success of conviction. That's the problem, and that's the thing that power sharing is trying to fix. It's trying to find a way for Robert Mugabe to get out peacefully and preserve his options. Because quite frankly, Robert Mugabe is not having a lot of fun ruling Zimbabwe right now. And neither are many of the people that he's dealing with. But he doesn't have an option to get out when you bring in this International Criminal Court conviction, because there is no way for him to leave. What it forces him to do is to hang on to power any way he can, to resist any form of power sharing. Why do we think this is working at the moment, ladies and gentlemen? Because the Prime Ministerial post for the Changarai was created in the Constitution just last month. Because the talks have stalled, not been stopped, ladies and gentlemen. This is progress. Because every ministerial post has been assigned to that was required, has been assigned to a member for the Democratic Change Minister, except for one key point. Why do we think there are other problems, ladies and gentlemen, that will undermine the opposition here? Because the first thing that Robert Mugabe will do, just like al-Bashir did in Sudan, is cut out all foreigners in the country.
Yeah.
He's called for aid on cholera, ladies and gentlemen. He's going to kick all those people out the same way. The final problem here is that Robert Mugabe is not the only guy in the picture. They want to try all of the ZANU-PF leadership. But what they don't realise is that's like trying to try the generals, it's trying to try the police ministers. If you want change in the country, try fighting that. The second part, ladies and gentlemen, as I've already told you in a lot of analysis, is we think the African Union and the South African Development Congress must be empowered to do this. Their model goes right over the top of these regional institutions. It's their pressure that's working on Mugabe. It's their pressure that's working in Zimbabwe. And it's their pressure and oversight that will ensure that Robert Mugabe is not replaced by someone else just as bad. Thank you.
I thank the member for the opposition for his speech and call upon the government whip to close government's case.
I have two questions I want to answer in today's debate. Number one is, does engagement work or will it even work in the future? And second is, does prosecution weaken his political currency? Now let's go to the first question first. Does engagement really work? Because we've argued consistently on government side that engagement simply props up this particular regime, and engagement is actually complicity in the crimes that Mugabe has been committing. But these are the little, signs of success that they like to bring out in government side. They say, you know what? He's accepted foreign aid because of a cholera outbreak. As a matter of fact, not only did he steal the aid, a lot of aid workers were shot, over 1,000 people actually died. They said, you know what, they're very proud of the fact that he allowed for power sharing with the political opposition. We see that the fact that he controls most, if not all, of the ministries, the opposition leaders have no access to the funds, have no access to the police force or homeland security, have no access over arms, please sit down, makes this power sharing agreement impotent. As a matter of fact, that's not any real concession. It just lets South Africa feel better about itself so that South Africa can tell the world, hey, we achieved something tangible there. We don't have to do any much more things there. As a matter of fact, this power sharing agreement cuts both ways. It makes Mugabe seem like he's actually doing something, but we know better. And it makes the South African leader actually feel good about themselves. But we say this is extremely fake and unsustainable. Opposition party leaders and human rights activists are being abducted or being killed. Over 18 have gone missing in the last 2 weeks. Basically, what we're saying is we've waited far too long, and this combination of sanctions plus engagement just isn't working. The sanctions are hurting the people because they have no access to economic resources. I'm assuming you want to maintain them because you won't say let's lift all sanctions and give him all trade and aid. Please sit down. But we say that the presence of engagement still dilutes the effects of these sanctions. So at the end of the day, continued engagement with him does nothing to his backers. As a matter of fact, it legitimizes the stance of his backers and dilutes these sanctions. Now the bigger issue really, and this is where I'll really delve in depth into their extension, is whether prosecution weakens his political currency and the stability of and the reputation and credibility of the ICC or not. What they got from opening up, and I'll deal with this very briefly, is that it allows Mugabe to demonize the West. In a while, we say there's no extra harm in this because he does this all the time. But his own people know that this rhetoric is hollow and empty. And the domestic population know this as well. And we say that he's already afraid for his life regardless, because he knows that his time is about to end inevitably. So if he's afraid for his life regardless, please sit down, we say that regardless, he will still crack down on the people, he will still, hoard resources and arm his private militia and kill the opposition. No one has talked about giving him amnesty. That's not on the table. Please sit down. He knows that when he leaves, his head is on the guillotine. And that's precisely why, regardless, he will be brutal and harsh and there's no added harm. But this is what they're afraid of. They say that China and Russia will not respect the ICC ruling. They might not be completely happy about it, but Mr. Chair, last time I checked, debates are comparative. We say it's going to be harder for them to continue to coddle Mugabe if you have the ICC ruling in this particular context, because the ICC actually has a lot of credibility. The hybrid courts with ICC support that are trying Charles Taylor are very, very credible, and a lot of people support these trials. The courts in Sierra Leone, for example, or the courts that are about to be put up in Rwanda to try the leaders of the Lord's Resistance Army are very, very credible in that particular region and across the world. So ICC is not something that people will just poo-poo away and say doesn't work. As a matter of fact, in a while, international law has a lot of moral force. When the United Nations finally labeled the crisis in Rwanda as genocide, that's the only time people acted. They refused to act, they refused to intervene unless someone put the legal label there of it being a genocide. But then Victor says, you know what, there's a fear that it will be seen as politically motivated. Why aren't you trying the leaders of China? Why aren't you trying the leaders of the United States? The answer is fairly simple. We agree that these people have offenses as well, but this debate is obviously about extents. The Chinese government is becoming more increasingly accountable to the international community. They hosted the Olympics. They explained themselves to the media over several crises. The US had some measure of support over Iraq and allows United Nations access there. Mugabe, on the other hand, refused to let Kofi Annan, please sit down, or Jimmy Carter in to talk to them. Before we go on to talk to you about the effects on the South African development community, which we've talked about consistently at closing, yes, Victor.
Madam, your model leaves United Nations intervention as the only option, which you seem to support. How's that working out in Congo, Sudan, and Somalia?
No. We talked about the South African community. This community has 15 countries, and initially it was very, very conservative, as they will concede. Initially, South Africa refused to even condemn these actions of Mugabe or even refused to consider kicking him out of power. But as of late, there's a significant degree of movement within the African Union. You have, for example, the Botswanan president or the Kenyan prime minister calling for Mugabe to leave office or calling for his resignation. As a matter of fact, please sit down, on their agenda, the forced removal of Mugabe is no longer as outlandish as it was before. But the problem is you still have some other countries dragging their feet, like South Africa. So this will not be seen by the African Union or that particular development community, please, as an infringement. As a matter of fact, it's going to be seen as something that bolsters their authority or additional help to lend moral force to what they're doing in particular. So we say that this move bolsters what some of the leaders in that development community have already been saying. Leaders of countries like Botswana, leaders of countries like Kenya, to get leaders of South Africa, for example, to finally listen. As a matter of fact, in the trial of al-Bashir in Sudan, you have witnesses and leaders from other African countries willing to testify before the prosecution closes its case in a month. So the African Union or the South African development community is not close to this type of intervention. As a matter of fact, they're supportive of this, and as a matter of fact, they consider it as complementing what they're doing in Sudan or complementing what they're doing in the case of Robert Mugabe. So at the end of the day, we have to remember that debates need to be comparative. What does their model do to the backers? It just legitimizes their foot dragging, it just legitimizes their laziness, and it legitimizes their complicity. That has to end. We need to lend moral force to the efforts we've been doing because people's lives are at stake. With that, we close.
I thank the government whip for a speech and call upon the opposition whip to close the debate.
Mr. Speaker, members of this House, what we told you on closing opposition was that the problem with the model of prosecution is that it targets the very way that we aim to get long-term stability in Zimbabwe. Why? Because it targets the ability for leadership in Zimbabwe to make any kind of concessions. Because if they ever engage in a power-sharing agreement with anyone else, they are not going to be willing to do so. And I'm going to tell you why right now, for the same reason that Victor did that was ignored. Because if you engage in a power-sharing government with someone, but you yourself are liable for war crimes, you feel like you and all the people in your party could be dragged to The Hague. And that means that who's left in power? Not the power share, but your opposition. They will never engage in power sharing, Mr. Speaker, when they feel like they have an international arrest warrant over their heads when they have been prosecuted. That's what undermines negotiation, Mr. Speaker. That's why prosecution targets the very ability to get long-term stability in Zimbabwe, and that's why we, on closing opposition, oppose this. What we told you, Mr. Speaker, is that at the moment there is a power sharing arrangement. No, thank you. And we concede that all along the government they've said that it's weak, but we never said that it was like, oh, Zimbabwe's perfect now because there's been a power sharing agreement. What we said is that there are institutions, there are situations on the ground that could, if we treat them right, lead to a power sharing peace situation in the future. What we told you in particular at closing is that Morgan Tsvangirai has discussed as part of this power sharing government not prosecuting Mugabe. That's how he got him to the table in the first place, Mr. Speaker, by looking at options like giving him an amnesty. What the government in this debate does is undermine the movement for democratic change, Mr. Speaker, is undermine the very people that they want to take government by taking the things that they have offered to get negotiations going and taking them off the table. That's the problem that we have, and that's why we think it leads to no long-term stability. I'm going to look at 2 points in my speech. No, thank you. Firstly, what are the outcomes of prosecution? And secondly, how do you solve a problem like Zimbabwe? How do you keep a wave upon the sand? So firstly, what are the outcomes of prosecution? What we heard from the opening government was that it gives us unity of condemnation. No, thank you. Well, we said that there has been condemnation for a while and that it hasn't worked. And then Laloy adjudicated in his speech and said, we can't say that. That means that we lose. Bad news, Laloy. Here's why. Because there has been international condemnation for a while. We kicked them out of the Commonwealth. It's what the opening government themselves said. We kicked them out of the Commonwealth. That was a massive symbolic gesture which had approximately zero of the effect that you want a massive symbolic gesture to have. And you have not once given us a difference between the ICC and the Commonwealth. Oh, you said it's a non-political body. Well, how about something that you've been involved in that lets you have access to governments around the world and preferential trade deals, and we kicked you out of it. Not to mention cricket, which I'm told Zimbabweans are pretty fond of. No, thank you. We kicked them out of that, and it had none of the symbolic resonance that they wanted it to. We've had no analysis as to why the ICC magically would do it. Because what we told you is, under their model, you have the same problems. Exceptions to international condemnation. China, Russia, and in particular, no thank you, South Africa, Mr. Speaker, are support for Zimbabwe. They haven't given us a shred of analysis for why South Africa will actually change their opinion. They said, all of a sudden, this ICC motion, no thank you, will let the South Africans know what's going on the ground. I'm pretty sure South Africans know what's going on the ground. They have the ability to read just like me. They can go to www.iht.com, no thank you, and see what's happening. Well, what does that mean? It means that any symbolic benefit that they have under their model is going to be completely overwhelmed by the uselessness of their model, Mr. Speaker. So what's South Africa going to see? That the world has gotten together to condemn Mugabe. Again, why is any of that going to change South Africa's conduct? It won't. They've given us no reason why it would, Mr. Speaker.
Sir?
What we told you is that Mugabe, under the outcomes of prosecution, is going to crack down further. And the very simplistic response we heard across the government is, he just can't crack down further. He absolutely can't. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to be a little bit simple here as well, but he can. Do you know why? Because he hasn't been killing the members of the MDC yet. But he can if he feels like that's the only option he has. Because he can't negotiate with them, he can't share with them, because the second there's a power sharing situation, he might be captured in the middle of the night and sent to The Hague. No, thank you. So then when Julia got up here and said, well, we're just going to prosecute all the members of the ZANU-PF. No, thank you. In response to our point of information, we say that's a terrible thing. Why? Because now it's not just Mugabe who's afraid of power sharing. Now it's not just Mugabe who's afraid of the international community, but it's everyone that currently has power in Zimbabwe. And that's the worst thing you can do if you ever want stability. So this leads to my second point. How are we going to solve a problem like stability? And first, I'd like to take Julia.
Tsvangirai says that the power sharing agreement has totally collapsed. How many more times does Mugabe have to lie to us before he's brought to account?
Yeah, it actually hasn't completely collapsed, and here's the key thing. Because what Mugabe has done is made actual practical concessions. He's allowed the MDC into the government, Madam Speaker. We understand why Morgan Tsvangirai says that. It's because he wants money and he wants international support. That makes sense. But the reality still exists that under the status quo, Mugabe has allowed the MDC into the government. Why is that better than nothing? Because it's so important for the Zimbabwean people to see that there's an opposition that's functional, Mr. Speaker. We think that's fundamental to getting some kind of long-term solution in this situation. Why? Because the MDC must be involved, because they're the ones that you want to rule the country. But under their analysis, they don't get involved. They get cut out, and that's the problem that we have. No, thank you. We told you that on a domestic level, their policy removes the options of the actors in domestic Zimbabwean politics. It removes their options to be moderate, to be reasonable. Why? Because even if they want to, the only impetus they have right now to power share isn't the goodness of their hearts, it's protecting themselves. That's the number one impetus that they have. And that's what you take away when you say we're going to send you to The Hague and possibly kill you. No, thank you. But on a regional level, ladies and gentlemen, we think that having an ICC prosecution ignores regional actors, and that's terribly dangerous. No, thanks. Why? Because that's how Mugabe's regime has survived so far, with support of regional actors. Because we can get as much Western condemnation together as we want, but as long as South Africa is supporting them, as long as other rogue dictatorships in Africa are supporting Mugabe or whoever replaces him, we'll never get actual change. We'll never get an actual solution. And so the problem we have with their model is, firstly, it ignores African states and doesn't do anything to actually get them to agree. It just does something in spite of them. But secondly, it creates fear, ladies and gentlemen. Why does it create fear? Because there's a lot of dictators in Africa that are somewhere up there with Mugabe in terms of doing bad stuff. And if they feel like the international community is going to crack down on them and drag them into a prison, they are much less likely to engage with the West. They are much less likely to agree with our reasoning. When what we need the most is for the neighbours of Zimbabwe to agree with us. What we need most is for them to support change in Zimbabwe. And on a last and international level, Mr. Speaker, we told you that what this does to perceptions of multilateralism and perceptions of the ICC is it shows that it's impotent. Because on the off chance that Mugabe doesn't give himself over voluntarily, the model has failed and everyone sees international law failing. What we've told you is that if you want peace and justice in Zimbabwe, you need realistic options. Realistic options that allow for politics to occur within Zimbabwe and that necessarily involve the African Union and its neighbours. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we oppose.
I call this debate to a close.
Yeah, we're already
And,
Cheers.
Mark?
Yep, it's me. Julia, do you still have my red pen?
Almost at the camp.
It's fine if you still need it. Because my other one ran out, so at some point I want to get it from you by the end of it. Oh, it's a cruel irony when I'm using my pens to get used to.
Someone can come in and turn this off.
Oh, he said just it automatically does, so I'm just supposed to take it with so I don't have to touch it.
I'm also in
Does it actually physically have to be turned
Yes.
on?
Okay.
Oh, it's hard for me to move it every time.
Okay.
That's what he told me. So if it's his,
So it's gonna record our video.
huh?
So it's gonna record our video.
It's what?
It's gonna record our video.
Oh, good.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
That's
I'll
okay.
design it.
Victor, can you help?
Yeah, what did you find?
Just grab all my list stuff so that I'm not seeing.